Thank you very much for again joining us and being our speaker today.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for coming. I've so looked forward to this, and Mike has been great putting that beautiful flyer together and helping me out here. I have to start, in March of 2013, I spent an afternoon with my father, Thomas Haney, that was really life-changing for me. He was 93 years old, and his mind was very sharp. That day he talked about his time overseas during World War II, and I learned so many things about my father that I hadn't known. That conversation went on for several months, and I would go home and Google and bring back pictures to him. And the pictures that I brought back, I know that next day he lit up. Picture of the place that he was in England, and I was just so glad that I could do that and that he could share everything with me. I would just encourage each and every one of you to start a conversation with those people in your lives who mean so much to you. Please don't wait another day. You don't have to write a book about it, but will never regret that time. The memories that I have are priceless. And a couple of notes before I begin. Of course, I have a short PowerPoint presentation here, and then my nephew, Ryan Bonnell, will be speaking for a short bit, too, about his grandfather. Also, my father, Tom Haney, gave a presentation in 2011 at the Wings Over the Rockies Air and Space Museum, and we'll be showing that today. So you'll get to see him speak and hear him use his own words. And I have my book available. I'll have it in the back afterwards for sale if you like. And feel free to ask questions as we go. If I can answer them, I certainly will. Let's see, that picture there of my father was in the early 2000s. It's just one of my favorite pictures of him. His story in the book, of course, and his story in life starts. There we go. I must be pressing something I shouldn't. With his parents. There's my little pointer. Marie and Peter Haney, his parents, the pointer I have to hold, sorry. They were raised in Castlebar and Clifton, Ireland. They didn't know one another when they were in Ireland, but they came over to the States. They both immigrated. My grandmother came over at the age of 18, and my grandfather came over at the age of 20 years old. And if you'll note up there, the spelling of the name was Haney. That was his name in Ireland, but when he came to the United States, the New York Port Authority couldn't understand him, and they wrote it down as Haney. And so that was the name he had to use in the United States and the name that we've used ever since. It complicated his life later when he went back to Ireland for a little bit, and they didn't want to let him back. And so he was away from his family for a long time because immigration was difficult then as it is now, I think. Marie and Peter were married in 1916, and they lived in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was a neighborhood of amazing mansions, very wealthy people. And they worked for a wealthy family there, the Distons, that owned the saw works in Philadelphia. And Marie was a laundress, and Peter was a chauffeur. After a year of marriage, they started their family, and they had sons Frank, John, and Thomas. And here they are here. Again, some of my favorite pictures. But, and as you can see, Tom was in the center, the little guy in the center, not very old. And here they are here. But I think the stark contrast in the two photographs, when you see them beautifully dressed in maybe a photography studio or maybe in the Distance house, the wealthy people they knew, and here, probably their everyday life. The coats and the clothes that they had on looked like hand-me-downs and were kind of worn. And my father would point at his shoes, and he would say, "You see those laces in my shoes? Those weren't laces, those were strings. I never had shoelaces for my shoes." So, again, not what we would expect our kids to do, but...
What color hair do they have?
Yeah. You got that. And again, there's Tom on the front porch of their row house. You can see maybe some of the other openings there, but spent a lot of summers there with a very small row house, but in Chestnut Hill. When I was doing my research and I spoke with a gentleman back there at one of the high schools my father went to, I said, oh, my father grew up in Chestnut Hill. And he said, oh, no, your dad didn't grow up in Chestnut Hill. No. And I said, no, he did. He really did. But he worked for very wealthy people there. So, and again, they had a fourth son, Joseph. So they're Tom, Joseph, and John. Let's see here. Chestnut Hill couldn't have been a better place for them to be born for immigrants during that time. It wasn't perfect. Yes, they were poor, but the community was very supportive, and both of my grandparents had a job. On Hartwell Lane, where they lived, there was a huge park, a beautiful park down the street, and the trolley was at the end of the block, the other end, and walking distance of the church and school there. There Tom is in grade school pictures. And the picture, particularly on the left, was one that I put on the front of my book because it was such a cute picture, but also because he was in that sailor outfit. And as I wrote the story, I realized he would say he spent more time on the boat than the sailors did, coming back and forth, back and forth. And then, of course, looking very studious in the next picture. And Tom was a very good student, and he was a great athlete. He loved baseball. He loved to go to the games there when he could peek in. Didn't have money to go, but he said he would peek in the stadium and watch. He was a great pitcher. He would actually pitch for a farm team here in Colorado after the war for a time. And I have to say, Tom and his brothers were normal, fun-loving boys, but they had their fair share of mischief, too. So Tom's high school graduation picture, of course, and then a reception at the Augustinian Good Counsel Novitiate. My father was in the seminary. He was in the seminary prep for 2 years of high school, and then went to 2 other schools, left there and went to 2 other schools. But in his senior year, then after he graduated, well, he hadn't graduated just yet, he went into the seminary. He needed 1 more credit of English, and he had more credits probably in Greek and Latin than he did in English. He was a Greek and Latin scholar. But there he is with his mother, his younger brother Joe, and again, his father was over in Ireland at that time and couldn't get back. Tom left the seminary sometime between 1939 and 1940. This is just after he took his vows to go into the novitiate. And he charted a new path in life for himself. At that time, there were 19 novices, and the research that I did showed that Tom was one of 14 that left. There were only 5 that stayed. So, what can I say? I don't know why. But, of course, Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7th in 1941, and the U.S. declares war on December the 8th. Here's a picture of Tom. This was sometime after that when he became a private, but on December 29th, 3 days after his 22nd birthday, he went down and enlisted into the Army. His training started in Camp Meade in Maryland, Jefferson Barracks, in Missouri, and Lowry Field in Denver. And as Tom would say, he found the best thing that ever happened to him in Denver, which was my mother, Mary Jane, finding her, his future wife. And of course, there he is actually at Lowry Field. I've incorporated a lot of their love letters, excerpts from their letters, in the book, because it gives you a real feeling for what he was going through when he was overseas, how he was feeling, and how Mary Jane was. It was such a tough time for the soldiers and their families here. But on June 3rd, 1942, Tom leaves from Fort Dix, New Jersey, and he boarded the Queen Elizabeth. At that time, this is one before it was retrofitted, but at World War II, it was retrofitted with anti-aircraft guns and modified to carry large numbers of troops. The Queen Elizabeth was a steamship and was the largest and fastest ship in the world. They didn't need an escort. Many times the boats needed escorts, but they didn't because that was so fast. I love this picture I found too, with all those soldiers pulling in and getting off the boat actually when they came back. It's pretty amazing when you see that many people. Because of Tom's training at Lowry Field, he was assigned, as some of his other buddies from Lowry were, to man the guns, the cannons that were on the ship. So he loved that. He said he got to be the first in the chow line, and when you're 22 years old, that's a pretty good thing. That's a nice perk. So they left there for an unknown destination, and that destination was England, Goxhill, England. And I had never heard of Goxhill. I asked my father to say it a couple of times so I could understand him, and maybe you haven't either. But Goxhill it was a very important station there for the military that flew over. It was a landing strip, and as you can see here, it was a balloon launching site. But with World War I and World War II, they used it as a landing strip. And let's see here if I can get this. Here we go. That's where it was, right here in Lincolnshire, in that area there. So it was right on the coast, on the Humber River. And the Germans were coming across that English Channel and bombing England. And they were so badly bombed over there in Goxhill. Tom spoke of sneaking cans of food, him and the other soldiers, to the villagers. He said they didn't have enough to eat. He was so sad telling me that, even at the age of 93, he still remembered the villagers and how badly he felt. He never flew while he was there, but he, what did he do? He taxied planes, he gassed them up, he did a number of things like that. But he did, on one occasion, I think save a pilot's life. When the plane landed, it had engine trouble and it had flipped over at the very end of the runway. And the bombs were on board. So Tom jumped up on the wings and knew how to disarmed him and prevented a catastrophe at that point in time on the base. The Goxhill Watch Office, let's see here. I'll just stay on that page for a second. The Goxhill Watch Office was the first landing strip in England to be transferred to the United States Air Force in 1942. There were many other fields that were later transferred over, but England transferred them to the United States so they could take care of them. That's the incredible help that we offered the English at that time. The Goxhill Control Tower was the first stop for flight crews coming from the U.S. to Europe, too. They stayed there for 90 days training, getting acclimated to the different flying conditions that they would have, and then they would go off to different areas in England and Europe. The Goxhill Control Tower was a historic icon for many of the airmen who fought in World War II. And that tower is now, it was taken down, it was purchased by the Military Aviation Museum, and it was brought over to the United States, and it's been reconstructed here on the left. I was privileged to go there in May, and I got to sit in the tower my father sat in 1942. So it was a very emotional time, but as you can see here too, they're starting to furnish it with authentic pieces. And you wouldn't believe the many things that they've already gotten, but it's just something that I would just encourage anyone that could get there to go and see it. They actually have one display case that has a bust of Winston Churchill and a hat that Winston Churchill was given to, that he wore and was given to the museum by his family. There are many authentic furnishings, as I said. There are more photos of the planes that are at that museum and pictures of the tower that are on my Facebook page. And I put that on the back of the cards I gave you there, so you can see that, and then the website if you want to see it. But I was there, and it's amazing, the planes that are there. So, in November, Tom and many of his fellow soldiers departed by ship again from Liverpool, England, and Tom was again a member of the gun crew. And they got there and found out that they were part of Operation Torch. Operation Torch was the effort to take back North Africa and to get control of the Mediterranean, air control of the Mediterranean. Tom said, he recounts, he said, we were greeted initially by the Germans still there with their fireworks, still trying to shoot off some fireworks, he said, but they left very quickly. That night, Tom and the others slept on the sidewalks in Iran, and the next day, he marched to Lasenia and Tafarui airfields. He said that was the longest walk he ever took, the longest march he ever had, and carrying his duffel bag, you can only imagine. So Tom would work at Tafarui Airfield fueling B-17s and B-24s using 5-gallon cans of fuel until the fuel trucks arrived. So for several weeks, that's the only way they could fuel was to take 5-gallon cans and have those shipped in and do it. But they readied the airfields so the Allied planes could now land there. But you can see Tom, I'll just use my pointer here, down here, the Americans and the British. He came with the British, and that's where he stopped, right there in Iran. So some pictures of Tom in North Africa. There he is working in the airfields in North Africa, and he would laugh. He said, how stupid I was. I'm standing there with a cigarette in my hand. Oh yeah, there was a lot of things he did. He was very funny in the things he told. This was also a picture that he had taken of himself to send back home to Mary Jane. And he told her she could look at that instead of the funny papers on Sunday because he had grown a mustache and he thought she might get kind of a kick out of that. But next, Tom would actually train as a gunner. He had taken gunner training while at Lowry, but particularly for the B-26. Oops, sorry, I'm getting carried away here. Okay, got to hit the right button. So this is Tom right here. I don't know the names of the rest of the crew, but it gives you kind of an idea of how massive that plane was when you look at those grown men down there. They started flying missions in North Africa, and then they were on to the Mediterranean in Sardinia, Italy, France, etc. I wanted the readers of my book to see the inside of that so you could understand what it must have been like, the cramped spaces, and then where Tom was. He was a top turret gunner and a tail gunner, but mostly the top turret. I actually was referred to a woman an artist online that was up in Tacoma, Washington, and she did it. Overnight she sent me this, and then she told me later, she didn't want to take any money for it, but I insisted that she did, because she was in the military, and so her heart was really in this project with me. The B-26 was massive. It was 58 feet long, 64 feet wide, and 20 feet high. So Tom always wore his flak jacket and his helmet for protection, and of course there he is with another picture that was taken and one outside the command tent. But in spite of wearing his flak jacket and his helmet, Tom was injured during a mission flying over a harbor in Naples, Italy. He was hit in the face by shrapnel and received the Purple Heart for that injury. Tom recorded an audio tape for his children and especially his grandchildren, and he details several missions, which I put in the book, that were memorable to him. And the other things he would describe would be intelligence briefings, flight schedules, a typical day, mail call, between that and the chow line. Those were the two best days, he said, for him, two best times of the day. How they prepared for the flight, takeoff and landings, the escorts that would follow them out, and just much more. In the book, again, Tom describes several missions that he was on. In fact, Tom's very first mission was very memorable. He said the target was an airfield in Sicily, and he said our bombs found the target, but the flak that day, the shrapnel that was coming through their plane was ripping the cover off. It hit hydraulic lines and fuel lines in his plane in particular, and the formation was scattered. It was so dark they couldn't even track one another. So they had to land. So for your first mission, it was quite the, the baptism into flying. They managed to land at a field in Cape Town, North Africa, where General Rommel was just leaving. Yeah, they were getting him out of there. It was working. They patched the hydraulic and fuel lines, he said, with a little bit of masking tape, something normally you would never use to repair those. But he said it held. And then another plane was forced to land from his group right by him. But their plane, would not fly, so they got into his plane. And they actually managed to fly back through the Atlas Mountains and back to their base safely. Tom did say that when he got back to his tent, his buddies were already splitting up his personal property because he'd been reported down. And Operation Shingle was a mission that Tom talked a lot about because that was a mission that would impact him for the rest of his life. The target was Anzio beachhead in Italy, and Tom's plane took off from Sardinia, which is an island off the coast of Italy. On takeoff, both engines began malfunctioning, and the plane eventually crashed. The fuel on board, and again we have bombs and full fuel because it was so close to just take off. The fuel caught fire and it started spreading. And then the bombs, there were 8 500-pound bombs that exploded in a low order detonation. Now, the rest of the crew had gotten out, but Tom was in the back and he had to dig his way out. And so he struggled, and as he was just about to get out is when that explosion happened. And so it threw him up in the air about 15 feet and then down again. It was the concussion of those bombs. It wasn't a full explosion, but it was the concussion. Well, he got up and ran, but he was seriously injured and was hospitalized. It was several years after the war, actually, because being in Sardinia and Cagliari was the hospital. They couldn't do a lot for him, although they tried everything they could. But the x-rays several years later showed that he had actually broken his back in that crash. Tom would fly several more missions after that, but eventually the flight surgeon grounded him, but only for a short time because Tom was insistent that he be put back on active duty and flew several more missions. Tom was showing signs of what they then called combat fatigue, or what we now refer to as PTSD. PTSD would become another battle that Tom would fight, and this one he fought for all of his life. Tom had been over there now for 24 months, hadn't gone back. Some of his other crew members had gotten back, but there was a mistake on how many missions he had flown, and so they kept him over there, and I think maybe they just needed him at that time. So he came back and went to Philadelphia, and Mary Jane left Denver, Colorado on a train, and they were married. So there's their picture of the marriage, the wedding. They honeymooned in Atlantic City, and 30 days later, Tom was sent back overseas. He said, I never dreamt they were going to send me back. I really thought this was it. I was going to stay. But in 30 days, he was sent back over. But this time, he wasn't connected with his former crew or with the 320th Bombardment Group. He was sent to a camp near Caserta, Italy, between Rome and Naples. He trained the new airmen coming over for the U.S. and some of the pilots and crew members in France. So Tom returned home to Denver in December of 1944, and he was honorably discharged in 1925 on May 22nd. And there they are in Grand Lake. At that time, Tom was credited with flying 55 missions, and he received medals for his skill and bravery. He received some medals when he got out, but some he didn't receive till many, many years down the road. The Forgotten Heroes campaign presented those to him, and all the family could go, which was quite an occasion. But these were the medals that he was awarded. Of course, the Purple Heart, the European, North African, Middle Eastern Theater Medal with 3 bronze stars, the Air Medal with 6 oak leaf clusters, the Distinguished Unit Badge, the Good Conduct Medal, the National Defense Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, and the French Croix de Guerre Medal. So Tom and Mary Jane raised their family in Denver. And they were planning on, I think I heard that. You're right. And had 11 children. They had talked about maybe having 6 children, but what can I say? So from the left on the upper row, that's my brother Mark, my brother John, myself, my brother Tom, my sister Joan, and my brother Jim. And then the bottom row from the left, that's my sister Jackie, Katie, Mary, my mother Mary Jane, Tom, Julie, and my sister Maureen. Tom would never stop praying. Having been in the seminary, those prayers meant a lot to him, and they helped him through so many tough times, through that PTSD. And I can remember seeing him, and he'd be sitting in the living room with his prayer book from the seminary, still saying those prayers. And he certainly knew the power of prayer. Sorry, I'm pointing it the wrong way. This one doesn't want to go. Try it now. Very good, thank you. Growing up, I remember Dad reading the newspaper and reading the comics, and Beetle Bailey was one of his famous. I think someone patterned that after Tom, because he earned the nickname of TP, as in Thomas Patrick, on KP by his buddies. He spent a lot of time, and some of it deservedly so, but oh gosh. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and again, he laughed about that nickname a lot. He always talked about that. But now, I'm going to have my nephew, Ryan Bonnell, get up and say a couple words. Ryan spent a lot of time with his grandfather, wrote a paper about him in high school or college, I'm not sure. And Ryan is also a stand-up comedian. He does that part-time, and he'll be at the Comedy Works this coming week on Tuesday. But we thought maybe he could also tell you a couple of the humorous stories about Tom. And then we're going to play that video of my father at the Wings Over the Rockies. And
is a less aggressive Stone Cold Steve Austin with a Twinkie problem. Okay. Okay, no, I really wanted to talk about my grandfather. It's an honor. His humor has led me to doing stand-up, trying stand-up, and, trying to get better. My grandfather loved sports. He was a huge sports fan. Anybody sports fans in here? Oh, yeah. Yeah, Bronco fans? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was a huge Broncos fan. And towards the end, he couldn't watch the Broncos games. He said, if I watch anything, something's gonna go wrong. I think that's how we all feel about this season, right? Okay. So we talked about the 11 kids. He had over 40 grandkids as well. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So I have over 40 cousins, and I can list them all for you too, if you're interested. Patrick, Connor, Patrick, Megan, Connor, Patrick, Megan, Connor, Patrick, Megan. We're not that creative when it comes to names. Honestly, when we're giving out names, it's kind of like a big episode of The Price is Right. Instead of names, though, it's just full of generic names, instead of dollar values. Oh my God, this is the best moment of my life. Baby, we did it. I can't believe we got here. Paul. Oh my God, we got a Paul. It's our third Paul. My baby girl's gonna be named Paul. That's right, little Paul has won a lifetime supply of Kraft macaroni and cheese, a 2004 Toyota Camry with 200,000 miles. And when Paul grows up, he'll become an accountant's assistant. Congratulations, Paul. We're not that creative. So, I was very grateful. My grandfather read and wrote a lot of letters to to my grandmother, full of humor, love. Tried to teach her everything's going to be okay with laughter. I'm grateful that it's transposed to me, because there's constant times I'm using my best humor to talk to my wife so she forgets that I spent $50 on video games, movies, and beer this week. Should have done that. But I have a little gripe with my wife real fast, everybody. My wife and I have been together for 15 years. No applause for 15 years. Thanks, guys. I'll hold it. But she's from West Virginia, and she says West Virginia is not from the South. I say you can't play 55 minutes of the championship game on one side and go to the other side and consider yourself a winning player. So I would like to read a text message that proves that my wife is from the South, okay, everyone? But I'm going to have Morgan Freeman read it real fast, okay? Daddy felled my favorite tree. Took out the phone and the power lines. Everyone's okay, but mama be pissed. LOL. If you add the tag to that, until the creek rises, forever yours, Theresa May. It's the most Civil War thing you've ever heard in your entire life. So I would just like to end on this. First and foremost, please go see Susan afterwards. Go read the book. It's amazing, everybody. Please, it's awesome. But as she said, my grandfather flew 55 missions in World War II. And most of those were bombing missions, everyone. That's pretty impressive, right? Mm-hmm. The only person who's done more bombing is me at open mics. All right. My name is Ryan Bonnell. Everybody, you guys have a great time. My grandfather.
Do you have any questions right now?
Yes, if there's any questions, I'd answer.
Well, we hope you'll stick around, but Susan and Ryan, both of you, we'd like to thank you very much for being our speaker and a little challenge coin.
Thank you, that's
Remember,
beautiful.
that's Ryan, you two are very entertaining.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, everyone. Please stick around. We have more refreshments, coffee, the museum's open upstairs, and above all, visit with Susan and her family. And Susan has copies of her book in the back there. So, thank you very much. Yes, I can, in fact, I can set up, after a bit, we can go ahead and play the interview of your father.
Great.
At Wings Over the Rockies. So we'll work on getting that set up while everyone's visiting. Yeah. So thank you again. Yeah, oh, excuse me, Bob, yes.
There is a model of a B-26 over there, if you'd like to take a look at it. There's also a picture of a friend of mine, Richard Capps, who was a tail gunner on a B-26. And he flew 45 missions. And it probably doesn't apply to your grandfather, but I asked Slim one time why he flew so many missions. His answer was, I was making so much money on the black market, I couldn't go home. And knowing Slim, that was probably true.
Susan, where did the bombardier set?
Our nose.
Just below the pilot, I didn't know that,
Well,
so.
I didn't either.
Well, quite often, the nose gunner also then served as the bombardier
Okay.
during that, because that would give you the best vision of where
Yeah,
you're
but you
going.
can,
Mike,
on the
Yeah.
picture, you can see
screen,
right here.
turn around.
Oh,
Oh.
you can see right there where the
There we
bottom
go.
is. That surprised me
Yeah.
too, that they were way down there, but it makes total sense. You had such a good view from there.
Well, double duty, yeah.
Yeah. Well, please, thank you very much, and stick around, visit.